Again, welcome to the webinar, Drivers of Wildfire Suppression Spending. Um, Down in the note area down below, you'll see that there is a synthesis, and Cass and Autumn will put up that web address so you can download the synthesis at the end of their presentation, but I just wanted to put it down there so you could copy it down. There is a synthesis available that speaks to the same topic, and we urge you to go ahead and download. It is free. Um, and now I would like to introduce our speakers today. Cassandra Mosley, the Director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program, the Institute for Sustainable Environment, University of Oregon, and Autumn Ellison, who's a research assistant also at the Ecosystem Workforce Program. They will be answering questions that you have. Please type those questions in the chat box, and at the end of the presentation, they will answer those questions. So without further ado, Cass, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Um, we wanted to talk today about this synthesis, or sort of provide folks with the highlights from this drivers of wildfire suppression spending synthesis that we did. And I wanted to sort of, before we get started, acknowledge the Northwest Fire Science Consortium for funding this synthesis as part of the Northwest Fire Science Consortium and Joint Fire Sciences for funding this synthesis. It's been a great opportunity for us to work on an issue that we are really interested in, and we hope others are as well. Feel free to type in questions as we go, and if they're clarifying, I'll try to interrupt myself and answer them. Otherwise, it will take maybe more substantive questions at the end. Um, and how we're going to handle this is that I'm going to kind of just go through the presentation myself, but Autumn is really going to participate actively in the Q&A section. As you can see from the presentation or the synthesis when you download it, she's listed as the first author and really did the bulk of the work on this project. So, as you all know and love, or we all know and obsess about perhaps, is that wildfire is getting a lot more expensive in the United States. And estimates vary, but we're talking well over $1 billion in suppression costs a year at this point, pretty consistently. It's something, wildfire is something that takes up half of our Forest Service budget, both preparation and hazardous fuels reduction, and as well as suppression. And the Forest Service is expecting fire to continue to increase dramatically. And so this reality is creating budget shortfalls, we're fire borrowing, and yet there's really little agreement on what drives fire suppression costs. There's a lot of variability in costs between years and between fires. And so the point of this project was really to get a handle on fire suppression spending costs. Given the increasing political scrutiny and review at every level, from Congress to the Office of Management and Budget, on the cost of spending, all of this massive policy making that we've had over the last 15 years from the National Fire Plan onward have talked about fire costs. And then there has been, as a consequence of that, a small but growing scholarly body of work that's emerged around the drivers of suppression costs. And so what we're going to do is talk about that today. So the objective of the synthesis in our conversation was to get a much more comprehensive understanding of the full suite of things that are driving fire suppression costs. And we did this through a literature review where we gathered and looked for any kind of peer-reviewed literature whose central focus was on wildfire suppression costs. We used keyword searches. In every article we found, we went through all of the references to check to see if there was other things we hadn't found. But we did exclude the gray literature on this topic. And the reason we did that for a variety of reasons, but one of them was to sort of create a very clear standard of who was in and who was what kind of articles were in and out. But also, some of the gray literature is varying levels of advocacy oriented, and it was pretty hard to create some sort of boundary between appropriate and inappropriate gray literature. So we excluded that entirely, even though there is some interesting information in that literature. So let me dive in here to the findings without further ado. Um, The trends in this, I guess one thing I'll say, just to point out, right, is we're talking about, and remind all of you that we are talking about a total of something like 20 or just over 20 articles. And and so anything we say, we just have to realize how small this literature is compared to much of the other fire literature that's out there. So, but that said, the focus on literature, how much literature on drivers has increased in recent years, and we're really focusing on the literature today that's been published since 2000. There are a couple of articles out there earlier than that, and they are referenced in our. Are they included in our synthesis?
No, we
Okay,
excluded.
so we didn't include anything written prior to 2000, but that's just a few art. There's a very small number of articles, and they didn't particularly seem relevant to the current dynamics. So the literature is often framing or starts framing uh, many of these articles frame the costs and the dramatic increases in fire suppression sort of as a setting, a stage setting. And so we want to just sort of bring this chart forward as an example of that stage setting kind of work that they're doing. And but I think that one of the things that's really important to know about those stage setting numbers is that um, while the number of fire starts has remained largely the same over the sort of this 25 or 35-year period, um, the number of acres has more than doubled, but the spending has increased by more than 3 times. And so what we're seeing is the same amount of fire starts, but these fires are somewhat larger now, but they're much more expensive. And so it's not, we can't just say more fires or more acres means more cost. There's something else going on. And that's, I think, what's really important to keep in mind here. We've got more going on than just more burning. So the literature really derives physical, the drivers, sort of breaks it into, or we broke it into 3 major categories: the sort of physical and environmental drivers, social environmental drivers, socio-environmental drivers, and management and decision-making drivers. And we're going to walk through what the literature has to say about each of these in turn. It's interesting. The physical and environmental drivers are clearly the most easily measured and most easy to include in models. There's a fair amount of forecasting models in these literatures, and these are often in there. And as well as sort of short-term, small-scale environmental drivers, as well as climactic drivers, are clearly part of a lot of models. We're seeing this, as I sort of alluded to, there is this correlation between expenditures and fire size, and large fires, large fires in terms of acres do account for the majority of the spending. And when you have more large fires, you sort of see this mirroring. And so some of the literature is finding this kind of relationship. And then very commonly, climate is a key piece that people are including in these models, basically, particularly in the forecasting literature that's projecting what fire costs will be, or trying to get some climatic variables in there, and use a variety of indices for what the current climate is or the projected climate is in any given year. And then these short-term variables that end up often also in fire behavior models are also being included in these cost models: weather, landscape conditions, fuel type, geographic location, regional differences. Although that's interesting because regional variation could be could be biophysical, could then also be political or social. And then fire behavior kinds of models and stand composition. These are all kind of well tried and true factors. But the challenge of these is that they are that even when you create models that have these in them and try to correlate fire costs with them, there's a huge amount of variability that remains unexplained, both between the individual, at the sort of level of individual fires, and also between seasons. And also, these physical conditions are not things that land managers can do very much about. They can't change the weather, they can't change the slope and aspect. Yes, they can potentially change stand conditions, and obviously we've spent a huge amount of energy over the last 2 decades working on changing stand conditions. But most of the other variables are nothing that we can do with management. So the scholars So we both know that we they don't explain all that much, and there's not the much we can do. So people have started to look at other drivers, and the main, so what we might call socio-environmental driver, is the linkage between the rising expenditures and the wildland urban interface development and the wildland interface. And I think conventional wisdom, everybody talks about how WUI is affecting fire suppression dynamics a lot. And you see a lot, this increasing WUI home building both has happened over the last few decades, is projected to continue to occur. The government reports are pretty clear that this is important, but it's pretty interesting also that it's not actually that as clear in the literature as you might expect for a variety of reasons. Some of them may be technical, but also some of them may be simply just a lack of study. What do we mean by private property in the WUI? Is it density? Is it values? Is it number? Is it threatened? Is it burned? All these kinds of things are pretty tricky to sort out methodologically, but also in reality, these issues of WUI are very interconnected with the managerial decisions, and so it's also difficult to untangle. But nonetheless, there's been a handful of studies, and really interestingly, I think, given how much energy is placed on housing in the WUI as an important factor in policy debate, there really are only 3 studies out there that have looked at this. And one of those 3 doesn't find any correlation between private property and fire costs. The one in Oregon and Washington, they said that there was no correlation, but they had a limited analysis. It's interesting also to speculate whether Oregon's land use planning actually changes the dynamics compared to the rest of the West. And then there are these much larger analysis studies of a large number of fires but early in 2007 and 2008. And what those 2 studies suggest is that maybe this is a significant driver of cost, but it's not been studied that much. And so I think we have to be while it's clear in these 2 larger studies, we also just need to be careful about sort of accepting a conventional wisdom without potentially further study. So, and I think this is sort of, as you get through these first 2 pieces, what we learn is that these investigations are finding biophysical characteristics alone and private property don't explain most of the variation in costs. So we have a lot of unanalyzed variance in these studies, and together they're really explaining less than half of the variance. And so we have a lot to still explain with these sort of the easiest to get a handle on factors. So with that in mind, let's turn to the third sort of cluster of management and decision-making drivers. And what the literature suggests is that, or is honing in on, a lot of unexplained variability is likely to be attributed to human decision-making and associated institutions that are driving those decisions and the incentives and structures. And so people are focusing in on things like the suppression strategy decisions at a very small scale, as well as the structural larger dynamics, both political and administrative, that may be driving these suppression strategies. And so the challenge of this is that this is much more difficult to quantify, particularly compared to those physical and environmental activities factors, but it's, in theory at least, more controllable by managers and by their both political and administrative bosses. Excuse me, let me grab a drink here. So, one of the things we've seen is what you see is in the literature, for example, is that there are some cost differences between aggressively and less aggressively suppressed fires. So that, for example, this one study looked at 1,300 large fires and found that those fires that were more aggressively fought and tried to get put out more quickly were cost less than those that are allowed to burn for a longer period of time. But they're careful to point out that does not include the long-term costs, either in terms of ecological objectives or lower suppression costs that could come with a less aggressive, more short-term let it burn strategy. And so we see also a simulation model study that looks at what would happen if, in fact, over time, what would happen to costs if you, in the short term, let fires get bigger in the short term. And what it suggests, in fact, is that there is a potential long term cost benefit with letting fires get bigger and spending more money in the short term, and that this cost savings could be quite substantial. Um, the other the so these are the so that's what there's another sort of subset of this sort of managerial decision, which is focusing on decision making influences or drivers of the decisions that lead to the spending. And what's fairly clear about this is that most of these influence there's a lot of hypotheses about influences, but relatively little information about how important these influences are. And part of that is almost simply a matter of there's some not a lot of studies, and the methodological challenges are pretty significant. So there is a couple of studies that focus on political pressure on fire suppression decision making, and found that political engagement of so if when you're in a situation where the fire you're fighting has had a lot of newspaper coverage, or you've had the senators and governors involved, those kinds of fires tend to cost more money than those that where there's a little political or engagement or sort of media engagement, suggesting that there are fairly clear sort of social political pressures to um, to fire suppression costs. And there's another study that interviews incident management team members, and find that this study finds that the incident management team members feel themselves in a very constrained institutional environment in which they have very complex rules and policies. Um, they feel like their incentives encourage them to take a very risk averse approach, both in terms of career path, but also not wanting to take risks that might lead to other kinds of losses that are not socially acceptable. And so that they feel like they're constrained in their ability to make cost-effective decisions, both by the structures that they're placed in around the rules they face, but as well as the political environment they find themselves. And so, sort of just to elaborate on some of the details that from this these kinds of studies, it's a small group of these, and this is a long, small font list. My apologies, but what these more qualitative studies are suggesting is that we have challenges around the budget structure, which essentially, while the global folks are telling scholars that while there may be um, a global level total budget that is being allocated, individual fire managers don't feel a budget at the local level. And performance measures don't particularly address this issue of costs or spending. And the federal directives are pretty while they're at some level, we've seen pretty significant changes in big policies like the cohesive strategy and the national fire plan to let fires get bigger and maybe less aggressive attack. There's a lot of mixed message in the culture. There's a lot of ambivalence in the way the agency directs issues on cost control. It's cost control, but except for, and those things like safety and structural protection and all these and political things that are other things besides just control costs that are very clearly coming from above. Um, and then in related to that, in how people do incident management, are also not particularly focused on cost control. Now, we could have a political and social discussion about whether cost should be a driver of these kinds of decisions, or whether we should take a blank check, but that's how people at least experience that. And then, and related to that, managers have a lot of reason to avoid short-term damage. The incentives are over other long-term benefits related to wildfire costs. And related, and I've already mentioned this, the fear of adverse outcomes and the risk associated with that. And so at the managerial level, risk-averse tactics are really uh, really a critical decision-making point for fire managers. So that's a really long list with a lot of small font. My apologies, but let me just summarize those as um, their literature seems to coming together around this lack of incentives to contain costs associated with kind of fire management philosophy and culture, policy directives, the valuation of a variety of resources, particularly structural resources. The budgetary structures don't particularly create a lot of containment. Management practices and liability protection all sort of create a sort of a perfect storm of challenges for cost containment, given the context of um, given the context in which they are operating. And so, I would take away from this whole section, which is one of the key pieces of the synthesis, to say that the incentives to aggressively spend outweigh those to spend efficiently. There are and so therefore one is inclined to focus your administrative and administrative reform on those kinds of things. But there are a lot of, and the literature is clear on this, pretty clear that scientists don't see a lot of room for an opportunity to make change in this area. And so one of the challenges we might ask ourselves, both as scholars and practitioners, is where's the room for change? How might that occur over time? How do we not just create more plans but actually create change? And that I think is a really unanswered question. So even despite the cynicism of much of these, or hopelessness of many of these pieces on the possibility for change, they do make a number of policy recommendations. And I just want to be clear: these are the literature's recommendations, not our recommendations. So these are the recommendations that came forward in the literature, um, around much more holistic approach to wildfire management and budgeting. Long both temporally holistic as well as holistic with respect to the whole suite of things related to preparation, risk reduction, and suppression and recovery. Thinking about different kinds of performance measures for wildfire, um, talking and working on a kind of risk, using a much more risk-based actuarial approach to budget planning, and thinking about wildfire budgets the way we think about flooding or other kinds of uh, natural hazards, where we have a regularized kind of hazard, but we use maybe a kind of a different kind of approach to the budgeting. And then really thinking about how we message around the politics of wildfire, and how we talk about wildfire, both benefits as well as the costs, and what federal land management agencies can realistically do. So, sort of just to recap here, we've got these physical. They're sort of breaking this literature into three parts. You have the physical drivers, which are the least controllable drivers, both prior to and during wildfires. Um, the socio-environmental drivers are somewhat controllable, but they have considerable policy challenges associated with that. The Western United States is not only a place with the of significant growing wild and urban interface, but also a lot of states that have virtually no land use planning, or very little land use planning, which is can be driving WUI development in ways that would be significant changes for those states, for example. And then the management and decision-making drivers, they're pretty difficult to evaluate. They're theoretically more in control of the agencies who are bearing the costs of fire suppression, but they are also politically incredibly difficult to change, from both a political sort of public relations piece, as well as um, a excuse me, from a public relations piece, but also just sort of an institutional change piece. Making change in a system as complex as this was not easy, and there are many competing, um, many competing things besides cost driving the way we do fire suppression, and those things are clearly outweighing the desire to control costs right now. So I think that in search for the solutions to the growing suppression expenditures and budget challenges, it will really require a focus on a full suite of drivers. You think about where we've been focusing most of our energy around this. It's been in the area of hazardous fuels reduction, but it's likely that we need to be much broader in how we think about that. And that really cost containment, we shouldn't underestimate the political challenges of cost containment and the challenges that an incident management team faces when in a crisis of a fire, and how difficult it is, or to prioritize cost containment. Um, and then I think it's worth really thinking about how you align risk management, with these drivers in ways that can really make a difference. So I, all of what we've been saying here in the last few minutes, it's really important to keep in mind that there are only 20 plus, just a few over 20 studies. Those studies, many of the same people are author on multiple of them. There multiple studies. There's sort of a group of a half a dozen subgroups of. There's just not that many studies out there, and there aren't that many scholars engaged in this work. And so we need to be careful about over concluding what we're finding from this. Um, we're really skimpy on things that measure the sort of the values of the costs of suppression in the short term and values in the long term. Whether, for example, the studies that look at well, if we spend more money now, do we save money later? Those kinds of studies are very thin on the ground, and really thinking about non-market values. Um, in addition, we have lots of data challenges around the complexity of the system. It's actually pretty striking that relatively few of these studies are focused on fire suppression as a complex system, when in fact I think that's probably the only way to get a handle on this. The data is difficult. There's many accounting systems, and none of the data around finances was designed for research, and so it's a kind of a brutal. As personally someone who's dug into this, I know how brutal these data can be, and that's just the dependent variable of cost, and then the things beyond that could be pretty tricky. So let me stop there and ask for questions. You can download the synthesis, and my apologies that the translation of this, but it's ewp.uoregon.edu/publications/working. And if you can only get to ewp.uoregon.edu, you can use the pull down menu publications, and you can get there pretty easily. They're in order of public in this list of working papers. They are in order by number, and this is working paper number 53. So let me open up to questions via the chat. If you have any, happy to take them. And Autumn has lots of details she can wade into if people have questions around particular studies. And again, I wanted to acknowledge our funders, Joint Fire Sciences Program and the Northwest Fire Science Consortium, and Janine for organizing this webinar.
Thanks, Cass. So anyone have any questions? It doesn't appear that that folks have got questions. It was a very thorough presentation. And again, that synthesis is available, and I would encourage y'all to download that at your leisure. Oh, we do have Alyssa is typing her question or comment.
Yeah, if there's any further questions on any of the things we've presented, the synthesis has a lot of the same similar statements, and they're fully backed up with the citations. And it's also important, I think, to point out that the working paper has an annotated bibliography of all the sources. So that's a great resource for looking at what the individual studies have shown and getting some more detail on that without having to read them all.
And there's a question from Alyssa.
Thank you, Alyssa. That is actually, I was hoping somebody would ask this question. So there's not much so contracted resources is discussed some in this literature. It's discussed a little bit more in the gray literature, but there's not that much out there. Um, we at the EWP are working on a project that will not directly get at cost per se right now, but it's a joint fire sciences funded project to look at how fire suppression contracting practices of the Forest Service um, drive how those decisions are being made about how they do contract, and then how that drives business incentives and business models, and not only where how businesses are operating and responding to the contracting provisions and the dispatch, the way dispatch works. So while I don't think the study will get directly at contracted costs versus in-house employee costs, I think it will start to uncover some of the key pieces of how the system, contracting system functions, and how it may be uh, creating incentives that affect costs. My hope is that the next study will allow us to work on that, but on the cost piece more directly. But that's we're still a good ways off on that. I would expect to start to see. We gave an initial uh, talk about this at the Human Dimensions of Wildfire last month, and I would start to expect to see working papers and peer review articles, working papers completed and peer reviewed articles done um, in the beginning of calendar year 16.
And I would say, just to directly answer your question, for what's in the literature currently, that contracted costs are mentioned and they're noted throughout some of the literature as potentially having an influence, but they're not investigated in the peer reviewed literature that we found.
Any other questions? That was a good question. That was something that I was wondering as well. Anyone else have anything? Questions or comments?
We have one.
We have another. Okay. So while John is typing, let me ask, so what would be the next steps in this? You did talk about future needs, but in terms of, what are the next things that what are the next steps here in terms of suppression costs and trying to find out more information on this?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a need for more scholarship here in several areas. Contracting is one. This sort of present value versus future value piece. And then I think we do really need to dive into getting a much better handle on these kind of both operational level drivers as well as the structural issues that are driving the incentives. And I think that's going to be a relatively big, important work. Um, and actually, John's question actually feeds right into this. His question is: there's a lot of variability. I guess they are happening at many spatial and temporal scales. Is there a dominant spatial and temporal scale at which variability is the greatest? And I'm going to slightly interpret that question and say that, and maybe John, you'll have to correct me when I answer the wrong question. I think that, or my instincts are based on this literature, that the drivers happen at a lot of different. Um, so there's spatial and temporal scales, but there's also organizational administrative scales that are really important. And I think that we actually have important drivers operating at multiple scale, political, administrative scales, and that is very tangled together right now. And that probably there needs to be a fair amount of scholarship around sorting out what drivers are sitting at the sort of operational scale at the incident, how those are being structured at larger scales by the either the contracting systems, how incident command is, what up the political drivers, those kinds of things, which happen at different political administrative scales. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but that's the thing I've been thinking about and sweating about as I think about this literature.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a lot of scales. Climate is, a planetary scale, and then we get down to the individual decision making by a single fire manager. And so, all along the path of the total equation of what leads to a fire cost, there's all these different inputs. And I don't think that there really is a scale per se that we can say yet where most of the variability is happening. Robin, your question, did you look at differences in costs when type 1 versus type 2 EMTs are used? None of the literature that I reviewed examined that explicitly. I would assume that there would be costs, but there's nothing that is investigating that in the literature that I came across.
And while folks are typing, I just wanted to remind folks that, excuse me, this webinar is being recorded and it will be put on the Northwest Fire Science Consortium YouTube site, and I will go ahead and type that address in so you can take a look and write it down, and it'll probably be up within the next couple days. So you have a couple more questions.
Yes, and I just wanted to go back to what Robin had just said. It is important, I think, to point out that the literature really does focus only on large wildfires. Something I thought about. And so in most cases, there probably would be type 1 incident teams. Most of the literature defines that as 300 acres or larger. Some of the literature defines it per cost. So I think in a lot of cases, the literature is really focusing only on large wildfires. And
so the type 3 teams are probably not appearing in this story very much at all.
Exactly.
Type 1 and type 2 are probably, but again, the types, it's just not that fine a scale of analysis to know kind of what kind of resources specifically are being used. I did see a really interesting presentation that hasn't been published yet at the Human Dimensions of Wildfire, where an economist is looking at whether certain incident management teams tend to use more resources than others. And so if that that article were to get published, that might help with some of these kinds of questions. But then again, those are also focused on, controlling for whether you're an incident 1 or 2. Do you know the answer to John's question? I can't remember.
So that was an article by Houtman et al. In 2013, and they used a process-based simulation model, and they integrated into that existing models that were developed, in other literature and other efforts on wildfire behavior and activity, climate models. It was a combination of existing models, and then it was a process-based model to extrapolate that into suppression costs based on how many acres burnt and some other variables in there. But hope that answers
and I would say that beyond that, like, there's a fair amount of econometric modeling, but it's not simulated. It's just straight up regression, standard econometric regression modeling. Much more just sort of not simulation. So relatively little use of simulation in this literature so far.
Right. Yeah, definitely. In the forecasting literature uses a lot of regression models, and that is basically just to get a handle on the standard process of it. Is that there's a variable to be tested, and they make the regression models, and then they test it on past suppression expenditures to see what is correlated, but they are standard statistical models.
Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the comments and the questions. And, as you read the synthesis, and if you have further questions, please feel free to email myself or Autumn, and would be interested in hearing how you're thinking about this literature as well.
Thank you very much, Cass and Autumn. This was really great. Thanks. And thanks, everyone, for participating.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.